Hello, and welcome to the first Trinity Hall Entrepreneurship Lecture, The Impact Revolution. This evening's conversation will explore how impact is or can be a driver in every investment, business, consumption, and policy decision we make, and ask whether capitalism can be reshaped to drive real change. I'm Professor Jennifer Howard-Grenville, the Diageo Professor in Organization Studies at the Cambridge Judge Business School, and a fellow of Trinity Hall here at University of Cambridge. In my research and teaching over the years, I've been fascinated by how businesses can generate and navigate change related to sustainability. So I'm absolutely delighted with this opportunity to speak with our guest this evening, Sir Ronald Cohen. We'll be in conversation for about an hour, and we welcome you to put your questions into the chat box. Ronnie is a true pioneer in impact investing, which involves directing capital and innovation to serve social and environmental good. He's played a pivotal role in the development of this sector, founding cornerstone institutions like Big Society Capital and Social Finance, UK, USA, and Israel. More recently, he's been working with the Impact Weighted Accounts Project at the Harvard Business School to drive the creation of financial accounts that transparently capture a company's true financial, social, and environmental impacts. Last year, he also published his third book, Impact, Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change, which we'll hear more about in a moment. This evening's event is a partnership between two organizations that I am enormously proud to be a part of. Trinity Hall, one of the oldest colleges at the University of Cambridge, and the Cambridge Center for Social Innovation, one of the newest centers at the Cambridge Judge Business School. With the generous support of alumnus and honorary fellow, Graham Ross Russell, the college and the center are working together to build a community of practice around social innovation and entrepreneurship. Together, we award the annual Cambridge Social Innovation Prize, celebrating outstanding founder CEOs of successful, scalable social enterprises with a proven record of impact. Through events like this, we hope to inspire others to consider how they too can create impact in their life and work. Ronnie, thank you very much for joining us. Your latest book, Impact, explores the idea of the impact revolution and calls on all of us to change how we do business, starting with where and how we invest our money. So first, let's begin by asking, why do we need an impact revolution now, and what are some of the key elements of it?
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for your kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here with you and with the Cambridge community. And in particular, I want to remember Paul Judge, who was a good friend of mine, and also Sahavi McGrath and Graham Ross Russell, both of whom are involved with the two organizations that have organized this meeting. So it's a special pleasure for me to be here with all of you. Now, to answer your question, Jen, I'd simply say that we're all aware that we can't continue in the way we're doing. It's obvious to us all, in this virtual meeting, that we can't cope with the environmental and social challenges we face. And the reason is our system has become self-defeating. Since before the Industrial Revolution, capitalism has pulled billions of people out of poverty. But in the early days of our industrial development and into the middle of the last century, governments could cope relatively well with the consequences, environmental and social, of the system, of the pollution and the social issues that were created or aggravated by businesses. Today, after globalization, the scale of this damage is too big, even for governments to handle. And so the question arises, well, how do we cope with these challenges? And many have diagnosed the challenges And there have been very few proposals for how we can actually cope with it. Mm-hmm. Some proposals have had to do with redistribution of income and general agreements about the environment, but we've seen in the latter case over 4 decades that these haven't led to anything. Mm-hmm. And so I think we must realize that the problem lies within our system and that we need to shift our system to the next frontier for capitalism, which is for companies and for investors to strive not just to make profit while ignoring the damage they cause, but to make profit while helping solve the big social and environmental problems we face.
Great. So you talk in the book about something, drawing the analogy with the fact that we actually didn't really measure and quantify risk until quite recently. And so the notion of risk return and its opportunity for people to therefore invest in a portfolio of investments that have different levels of risk associated with them sort of revolutionized how investment occurred in the latter part of the 20th century. And you talk about the triple helix now of thinking around risk, return, and impact. Maybe you can unpack that a little bit and explain to us how you see this revolution moving from one that developed, as you say, higher risk opportunities like venture capital that spawned innovation to the opportunities that we now need to pursue?
A wonderful question, Jen, and I want to relate it to my own life and career, if I may, because I think it'll help explain what's going on now. So when I discovered venture capital in the mid-60s, when I was at business school in the United States at Harvard, it was the result of a paradigm shift in investment thinking. Up until the early 60s, a typical pension fund or insurance company's portfolio would consist of the stocks and the shares and bonds of the country of the investor. When the concept of risk measurement was developed at the University of Chicago in the early 50s, and academics began to realize that while risk had always been there, we'd never been able to measure it, and why not look back at how volatile investments had been over long periods of time and extrapolate from that their future volatility. When that happened, it wasn't just a breakthrough in thinking. It had huge implications for portfolios, and portfolios shifted from stocks and bonds of national investors to the multi-asset class portfolios that we see today. Mm-hmm. And it is that which opened the door to venture capital, which in turn funded the tech revolution. Yeah. And it also opened the door to investment in emerging markets and funded globalization. Mm-hmm. And so the concept of risk-adjusted returns brought the concept of diversification, and investors use these concepts to improve their investment performance. Now, what is happening now gives me a sense of déjà vu. Mm. Because we see breakthroughs now because of technology, computing power, the storage of big data and so on, that we are able to measure the impact of companies, something we've never been able to do in human history. So we can now measure the impact that a company makes through its operations on the environment and turn it into monetary terms. We can do the same about the impact companies create through their employment and the impacts which companies create on people and the environment through their products. That measurement will, in my view, have the same implications as the measurement of risk a bit. Because when we begin to measure the impacts of companies, we begin to look at them in a very different way. It's eye-opening. If you look at the data at Harvard Business School, the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative to which you referred, we've already posted the environmental damage caused by 1,800 public companies across the world. Now, if I say to you, Jen, that 250 of these companies create more damage than profit in a year, that a third of them, more than 600 actually, create damage equivalent to 25% or more of their profit, and that together, the 1,800 create $3 trillion worth of environmental damage in a year. Doesn't it bring a new perspective on all of the discussion that we're having about environmental and climate change?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's fantastic, because if we don't grapple with what these quantities and measures and impacts actually are, we'll never be able to price them into the system. One of the things that puzzles me, though, is that if you think about risk was always there. We just didn't have a good way of measuring it. Environmental and social damage is always there. We haven't had a good way of measuring it. But when I want to invest, there's a room in my portfolio for low risk, medium risk, and high risk. There's really going to be no room in anyone's portfolio for low impact. So once we start to measure impact, what will that look like in terms of reshaping the market? Because the ripple effects you described were very real. Once high risk became an attractive way to invest as part of a portfolio, that unleashed innovation. Once low impact becomes unattractive, what then happens? Are all investors going to move in the way that we want them to? Are there going to be divergences within the market? What's your prediction?
Well, I think what's going to happen is that investors will direct their money away from companies that refuse to take impact into account. So if you take a company like ExxonMobil, which in my book, Impact, you have seen, creates $39 billion of environmental damage a year from its operations alone, without taking into account the oil it takes out of the ground. And the management of ExxonMobil says, we believe in fossil fuels and we're not going to go into clean energy. And its competitors, Shell, which is a bigger company, creates 23 billion of damage a year, and BP creates 10 billion or so, and both are going in the direction of clean energy. You'll see investors shifting. And indeed, the price of ExxonMobil has fallen like a stone on the stock market. The market capitalization of the company has fallen from 500 billion 3 years ago to 130 billion today. At the same time, if you look at companies like Tesla, which have pushed hard on the clean energy pedal, if I can put it that way, the stock price of Tesla multiplied by 7 times in the last year alone. And so the weight of the $40 trillion of ESG investment money in the market today is tilting the valuations of companies, shifting downwards those that pollute more or create social issues, and raising those that have a better performance in that respect. And indeed, in the Harvard data, you can already see these correlations between high environmental damage and lower stock market valuations relative to competitors. And it has very important implications for our financial markets, because regulators can't ignore the fact that there's now price-sensitive information in the form of impact data, which is accessed only by a small number of people who know about the Harvard Business School initiative. And so regulators will have to step in. I believe they will step in within the next 3 to 5 years, no further than that, and mandate that companies must publish audited, impact-weighted accounts that take into consideration the environmental and the social impacts that companies create, positive and negative.
So this is interesting because you're articulating some of the ways in which the impact revolution might actually have to look somewhat different from the risk revolution, if we want to call it that, in the sense that essentially by measuring risk, we could allow what's often called the invisible hand of the market to take care of it. But we're going to need transparency. We're going to need governments to step in and require disclosure. And indeed, disclosure can be incredibly powerful. The toxic releases inventory, which is data released about the toxic chemical emissions of US facilities. This is an old story, but in the 1980s, following the Union Carbide disaster in Bhopal, India, companies were required to disclose publicly what they emitted to air, land, water from their facilities. Within 2 years, the 7 billion pounds of toxic releases had been reduced by 20% without any further government action, simply the act of disclosure. So I get it. We're absolutely going to need to have some requirements, some standards, and like you said, some robust ways of measuring these things. A question from me, and I think it's related to some of the questions starting to come in from the chat, so keep feeding those in, please, and we'll get to those. But this then relies on incredibly good measures that people can trust, measures that we know are measuring the right things. And going back to the chemical releases, it's fantastic. 7 billion pounds of toxic releases is 7 billion pounds of bad. But how bad is it? That's a quantity, but it says nothing about the sort of human health or ecological health impacts. A lot depends on where it's released to, is it groundwater, is it air, et cetera. And we have very sophisticated ways of assessing those. But when we come to social and environmental measurements, what is your hope? What is your sort of realistic expectation about how well we can actually measure these things to get the right data into the hands of people who need it?
Well, when we kicked off the Harvard effort a couple of years ago, we did not expect to make, at least I did not expect to make as quick progress as we have made in bringing granular information about the impacts of companies. It turns out that these 1,800 companies disclosed publicly the impact of their environmental footprint. Mm-hmm. If that information is available, and if organizations like SASB and others have put it together into metrics that can be accessed by every user, then what is left is really the need to pick and choose among these metrics. Mm-hmm. And having decided which ones are the most reliable, create a pathway to monetizing them. And there's a ton of science around now in the environmental area about the cost of a ton of CO2, for instance, but also about other emissions, Jen. So actually, it is totally feasible to measure the environmental impact of a company. And then when we started to work on the employment impact and started to define what that meant and break it down into diversity, comparing the diversity within a company to the diversity around its facilities, ascribing remuneration levels to the missing people from excluded minorities at every level of the organization, we began to monetize that and to monetize unequal pay and gender inequality and advancement inequality. And so we're able to look at a company like Apple, measure all of these different elements, and say, you know, it has a $10 billion salary bill a year, roughly, in the US, but there's $2.7 billion negative charge for lack of diversity against that. And if you compare it with Costco, which is much more diverse and employs twice as many people, 160,000, look at Costco's performance. The charge is $1 billion instead of $2.7 billion.
Yeah.
And we're now measuring the product impact of companies. And we look sector by sector, and we define the criteria for measuring them. So in the car industry, it's how long the car lasts, how many miles you can drive it, how much maintenance cost you're going to incur, how many accidents and recalls it has, and you can measure all of these things and cost them. So I'm going into some detail in answering your very important question, because I think it's important that everyone participating with us in this discussion today realizes that we're on the threshold of this being reality. Mm-hmm. If regulators and IOSCO, which is the international organization that brings all of the world's regulators together, has identified the need for regulation around sustainability and is considering what form that regulation should take. If regulators within the next 2 or 3 years stipulate that we have to, as companies, to publish impact-weighted accounts, they will be published just a couple of years after that.
So that's fantastic. And also on the progress that is being made around measuring social impact, which is just so much more difficult, for example, than measuring carbon emissions. So some of the questions coming in from the chat are a bit more challenging in the sense that, can we actually expect what we sometimes call win-win opportunities here? So does the system that rewards profitability and rewards profit-making actually have the capacity to address multiple social and environmental ills? And specifically, some people are asking, what about the gap between the rich and the poor? What about the gap on CEO salaries versus average employee salaries? Is there a limit? Do you see a limit to what kinds of issues big companies are willing to tackle and governments are willing to force them to tackle? And then I think we want to also think about small companies, because they're not going to be subject to these kinds of same types of incentives.
Okay, well, let's tackle each of these questions in turn. I mean, on the first one, what is it that we can expect that this change of accounting, if you like, shifting to impact accounting and having the numbers incorporated in financial accounts, what could we expect that to do for the behavior of companies? Well, to the extent that there's now a change of values, which says consumers are more likely to buy your product if you have values that prevent pollution and child labor, employment of child labor, and so on and so forth. If it's easier for you to attract the talent, if your values are consonant in a similar way. If investors are more likely to invest in you, you're effectively making it much easier for companies that strive to achieve impact and profit at the same time to be successful than companies that strive to optimize just risk and return. So there's an element today of industries opening up to new entrants who can achieve profit and impact in the way that Tesla is doing, and disrupt the health sector in the same way that technology did previously. So I do believe, and you've given a very good example of it, that given the change in values, as this information about impact begins to flow very widely through our financial system, companies will get categorized into impact positive companies and impact negative companies. And investors will then begin to look at the second part of your question, which is, what is this company's impact in the area that interests me most? If I'm environmentally conscious, I don't want to invest in a polluting company. But if I'm also socially conscious, then I want to invest in a company whose performance in terms of diversity and lack of discrimination and so on is also good. And so when you talk in terms of gaps in pay, obviously the economic system can't resolve all of the inequalities that exist in our society. Governments have to play their role. They have to redistribute wealth and income, and they use taxation to do this. But if businesses are held to a higher standard, if they have to pay a living wage, if they want to be able to raise money and attract talent and consumers, if they have to treat minorities in an equal way and women and men in an equal way, then we will see their behavior improve quite simply. And now to the third part of the question, just as with financial accounting, and I think sometimes, Jen, when people begin to think about impact accounting, they want to hold it to an even higher standard than financial accounting. Like, there are plenty of issues in financial accounting, as you well know, which aren't cut and dried. The recognition of income for a software company is still a big bone of contention, and the accounting rules around financial accounts are changing every month, with major implications for balance sheets and profitability. The same is going to be true of impact. The important thing is going to be for us to take the first step and then to improve. And where small and medium-sized businesses are concerned, we will need a simplified form of impact accounting, just as we have a simplified form, or at least of impact reporting within accounts, just as we do with their financial accounts.
So thank you for clarifying that. And I think, certainly producing the incentives and allowing people to have the information that allows them to make informed decisions is a crucial part of it. One question has come in that asks, and I think it's relevant actually, as you cited earlier, the inflows, for example, to ESG funds have been phenomenal between April and June of last year. At the heart of the lockdowns, they exceeded annual flows prior. Now, that you could also point to negative oil prices around the same time and say, there were a large number of large companies, tech companies, that were doing well and doing good. So to what extent does an emphasis on impact investing through the regular channels actually potentially, and this is a question from the chat, potentially harm flows that might otherwise go into smaller companies, into sectors, like you said, that tackle fundamental inequality? Because basically, if big business can serve our needs as being both profitable and have positive impact, we need to look no further. We need to ask no more.
Look, disruption opens the door to competition from smaller, more innovative companies. That's what we saw with the tech revolution. That's how I made my career as a venture capitalist. If this disruption is going to be as big as the tech revolution, which I believe, it's going to open the door for massive investment into small and medium-sized businesses. And I think the ESG flows are extremely significant, not just because they're so huge, but because they express a deep feeling within the investor community that we cannot continue to look just as the profit of companies because values have changed. If as an investor, you only want to invest on the basis of the profit a company makes, and you ignore the impacts it's creating, you're going to ignore the plummeting value of your coal reserves, the plummeting value of oil. Oil isn't going to be a rising commodity now. The more clean energy comes in, the less oil prices are going to be high. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that $40 trillion worth of investors' money is seeking to achieve more than profit gives us the opportunity to improve the world massively. The SDGs, we all, I would imagine on this webinar, want to achieve the SDGs. There's a $30 trillion gap now between what's needed to achieve them by 2030 and what's available. Where's it going to come from? It can only come from investment markets. Well, if you begin to measure the product impact on vulnerable populations, and it becomes a consideration for investors, more money is going to go to companies that are going to be serving vulnerable populations in developed and emerging countries alike. You really will provide a different set of incentives. And so this link between, if you like, ethics and our economic system is going to drive capital flows to those in our society who have typically been deprived of them.
So let's think, I mean, we've been talking a lot about investment flows and there's more questions coming in, but your book deals with many other pieces of the puzzle. And so we've talked about the important role of governments in setting standards and holding companies, large companies, to these types of standards. We've talked about innovation, but not really specifically. But there's also philanthropy. There are, a number of people on the call will be interested in social enterprise and entrepreneurship itself. And how do all of these things fit together? Because fundamentally, we're talking about capitalism fixing capitalism, capitalism reinventing a new form of capitalism. Are we simply chasing our tail in terms of putting more money after the ills that we've created collectively? Or are there different ways that we can imagine the learning, not just the investment flows, to enable addressing, as you said, some of the social impacts that are occurring around the world that may or may not even be on the radar screen of the large companies that we've been talking about?
Well, what you've seen in the book, Jen, is that I believe, and I wrote a chapter about each of these groups, that impact thinking has major implications for the business models of entrepreneurs and the big businesses and the investment strategies of investors, that it has major implications for philanthropy and also for government. So in that sense, like technology, which has created the water on which every ship must sail, impact is going to create another layer of water on top of technology on which every ship will have to sail as well. Now, what do these implications amount to? In the case of entrepreneurs, they amount to young people in creating their ventures, seeking to achieve impact and profit, and developing a business model that delivers both at the same time and enables them to grow faster and more profitably in the way that, today we would say a Tesla has done. For big businesses, it means competing on the basis of products that deliver better value, that serve vulnerable communities as well as the well-off. Because if you're a pharmaceutical firm that comes up with a revolutionary treatment for cancer that costs $300,000 to administer, your impact's going to be deep but extremely narrow, like a needle. If, on the other hand, you come up with a cancer treatment that costs just a few $1,000s and can be used across the world, your impact is going to be massive in comparison. So it's going to affect the product strategies of companies. It's going to affect their employment practices. It's going to affect their logistics operations. Already we see big companies like Walmart and others shifting to electric vehicles. We will see more and more and more of that happening through the manufacturing and logistics of companies. And then when it comes to philanthropy, our philanthropic model has been based on giving donations. And that model has led to every charitable organization almost in the world having two characteristics in common: being small and out of money. Why? Because we don't measure anything, and because we can't bring investment. And if you begin to measure, as the social impact bond showed, you can attract investment on the basis of achieving a social improvement. So all of a sudden, a social entrepreneur running a charitable organization to help the homeless can ask themselves the question, how many people do I want to serve? If I can show that I'm more effective than others in taking the homeless off the street and into jobs, I can raise money like a business. I can raise a $5 million social impact bond or pounds, and then a £10 million one, and then a £20 million one, and so on. How many do I want to help? I may be helping 7 or 10,000 today, and there may be 100,000 or 300,000 homeless people in the world, and it's going to be in the UK, say, it's going to be aggravated by the COVID crisis. And then can philanthropy really continue to focus on activities and funding activities rather than the outcomes achieved? Shouldn't philanthropy be funding outcomes funds, as I describe in the book, that pay when the improvement in educational attainment or the prevention of people from getting from pre-diabetic to being diabetic has actually been achieved, and attract investment money opposite with its discipline, its open-mindedness with regard to the risk of innovation and so on and so forth. And finally, can we really concentrate as philanthropists with big foundations and big endowments in giving away 5% a year, while 95% invest in fossil fuel companies and companies that use child labor and so on and so forth? Or shouldn't our endowments and our grant programs both achieve the mission of our charity? And when it comes to government, finally, Jen, government has also focused on activities rather than on outcomes. Shouldn't we be budgeting according to the outcomes that we want to achieve? And again, use pay-for-success mechanisms that enable us to create competition from small businesses against, competing against big ones to see who can deliver the best social outcomes. So I think the implications of this new impact thinking are a paradigm shift throughout all of our activities.
So thank you for unpacking the role of each of those. And as you say, there's a chapter in the book that deals with each, and they all have a role to play, obviously. I suppose coming at this as an organizational scholar, I tend to think about things like transaction costs or coordination costs, the actual sort of difficulty of getting entities together to trust each other, to work together. And also to some degree, the question, and I think it's coming in from many in the audience, about is big always better? So if we move everything into a mode where we can measure impact and where we reward impact, and we do that at scale, not only might we miss certain forms of impact, we might miss certain forms of knowledge or learning or development that's extremely important and maybe even more successful, not scalable. So I'm thinking about in the social investment bond examples that you share in the book, 17 foundations needing to come together to deliver the investment, the government needing to be a real partner in developing what this even looks like, what are the metrics. Can we do that? Should we be doing that? Just because we can attract an inflow of capital to fund these kinds of things, what are the other bits, the non-financial bits, that might get in the way?
So, Jen, let's compare two things. Let's assume we want to improve the education of 10 million children in Africa and the Middle East. Our traditional way of doing it would be to put another $1 billion of aid, to give aid to governments or to NGOs. The new way of thinking is we would get the donors, the official aid organizations, the philanthropists, and the local governments to make commitments to a $1 billion outcomes fund. That outcomes fund would sign contracts with NGOs and businesses that can innovate in improving the attainment levels at school of 10 million children across the whole continent. As it signs its contracts with each one of these delivery organizations, be they charitable or a profit with purpose business, it gives them the power to turn to a development impact bond fund for education set up by Bridges Ventures and Credit Suisse and say, look, I have a more imaginative, innovative way of helping 300,000 children in northern Ghana to improve their attainment levels at school. If I achieve the numbers in the contract, I will get paid $30 million. I need $22 million in order to do that work. And I will give you a return of between 4 and 10%. Well, 0 and 10%, but your expectation might be that it's going to be somewhere between 4 and 8% on your money, and you will be helping with that money to improve the education of 10 million children. Which is more likely to succeed? The answer to your question is, if you really want to get serious about improving people's lives, let's not stick with ways of doing it that just don't work as effectively as they should. Similarly, if you want to improve billions of people's economic lives, you have to change the way in which our economies work. You can't do it by tinkering within our economies. And every few decades and sometimes centuries, you get ideas which shift us to a new frontier, enable us to do things that we've previously been unable to do. Economic systems change, as you know, Jen. We had mercantilism. Countries strived to accumulate as much gold as they could, because that was a sign of wealth. And then we came to capitalism, and we had the laissez-faire, and then we got to managed economies and welfare states. And then we had a throwback to the Milton Friedman era, to complete laissez-faire, let companies get on with just making money and worrying about nothing else. And now we're at a new frontier.
So that's really helpful. And the Africa example really unpacks this difference between it may be possible to leverage capital at scale, yet actually create delivery that is local and specialized and delivered through a number of delivery partners. I still worry that the transaction costs will be very high, but I think you're absolutely right. Our traditional aid models have very high transaction costs within them too. I am reminded of some work that my colleagues Johanna Mehr and Christian Silos have done on social innovation. And their work is quite intriguing because they argue that in certain areas, actually, we don't really need innovation. So we might be able to deliver education using some very tried and true boring gold methods. Yet, in all forms, often efforts that are apparently socially innovative with a capital I tend to attract the support, whether it be through grants or other forms of funding. They actually argue that it can be dangerous when people are living vulnerable lives. The last thing we want to do is, fail often, as they do in Silicon Valley. So do you think that there's a limit to this? So I totally get that we can leverage capital at scale for social problems. Should we force people to innovate?
I believe in social progress. The way I got into impact investment is because I was asked to look by the British Treasury in 2000, when I was still running APAC, at the issue of poverty and why we haven't made more progress in solving it. And the answer we can see today is because our system aggravates the social issues we have, because searching for profit only is no longer a sustainable way for our economies to progress. We need to shift them in the direction of government's objectives. Because if we don't, we can see what's happening. We're having floods, we're having fires, we're having migration as a result of them. We have rebellion in the streets in places as far-flung as France and Chile and Lebanon and the United States. We can see the evidence. I mentioned in the book that at the 30th anniversary of Apex Partners, the firm I co-founded, in 2002, I made a speech where I said, if we don't deal with those who are left behind in our society, a curtain of fire will come to separate the rich from the poor in our cities, in our countries, and across continents. And it's happening before our eyes. Now, the impetus for me in setting off on this road was to find ways of improving the lives of the most vulnerable. And I started off with philanthropy, and we invented the social impact bond in order to bring investment capital, which is far more plentiful. There are $200 to $300 trillion of investment capital and $1.5 trillion of philanthropic capital in the world, to bring investment capital to tackle social issues. In the process, I realized that our invention was actually a symptom of what was happening in the world, that optimizing risk, return, and impact within a social impact bond, where your financial return depends on the social improvement, was actually what was happening, where young people were refusing to buy certain products. And as a result of that, investors, and because talent wouldn't go to these companies that were manufacturing products, but in ways that were unacceptable, that investors became aware that these changes were occurring, and they too began to go in the same direction. If you have capital flows now measuring impact, that 40 trillion of ESG will become like the trillion of impact investment, which, by the way, is already as big as the world's venture capital pool. And the distinction between the two is the measurement of impact, which is the case with impact investment, but not ESG. But if we begin to measure the impact of ESG, we turn it all into impact investment. Now, if investment flows change the behavior of companies, our whole economic system begins to deliver solutions rather than create and aggravate social and environmental problems again. And so, sure, there are going to be unintended consequences along the way, which we're going to have to cope with. And as these transitions happen, you have to adjust. But that's how the world has progressed. Our economic system is changing before our eyes. You can either look at it, analyze it, and realize it, or you can ignore it. But if you ignore it, and you're a business person, or you're an employee, a talented employee of a fossil fuel company, you're going to end up paying for it, just as happened with technology.
Yeah.
If you ignored, as a retailer, the impact that technology would have on you, well, we know what happened. Mm-hmm. If you ignored, as a co-company, the impact the climate movement would have on your fortune, well, you wrote off a huge portion of your balance sheet.
So here's a question, and a number of people have asked this in the chat. We're getting back to the challenges of measurement because there's a timing issue. Many of the things, so yes, we are well apprised on climate change and we know what we have to do and we know the time frame upon which we have to do it. And even attributing those impacts to individual companies is relatively straightforward, actually, compared to some things like habitat loss, biodiversity, impact of toxic chemicals, impact of plastics. So how can we deal with the fact that some things are inherently difficult to measure and that the measurements themselves might not come to bear, that the actual outcomes and impacts might not come to bear until it's too late to create the incentive within the system to act on that? Is that something that that worries you?
So I would disagree that measuring plastic pollution is a difficult thing today. It's not. Like carbon pollution, you are able to measure the tons of plastic that go into a company and go out in packaging, on the other side. That is just not the case. When you get into diversity, up until now, we haven't had a way of doing it, but I've explained to you how we're doing it in the Harvard Business School effort. By all means, read the report about it. You're probably going to see a few thousand companies' employment impact emerge in the next 3 months or so. Let's use your expertise to improve it. There will be issues, just as there were with financial accounts. But there's no doubt at all that if investors begin to worry about the level of diversity of companies or the environmental damage they're causing and begin to rebel, as happened at the Procter & Gamble meeting just a month ago, where 2/3 of shareholders voted against management because of the deforestation management was causing through its use of palm oil. We've never seen that before. And you're going to see it, mark my words, around diversity. You're
So
going to see it.
Yeah, diversity is an interesting one, though, right? Because we can measure it, but are we measuring the impact? So we can measure the number of individuals from various backgrounds who participate in decision making, but are we measuring better decision making? Are we measuring greater inclusion? It's very hard to put numbers on some of these things. I'm also aware that we have that we're running up to the hour. So I'll let you speak to that, but I do want to sneak in a question that is relevant to the pandemic. I think it would be remiss not to.
I think your question is the way we move forward from frontier to frontier. When microfinance was invented, and it's grown to be $130 billion sector, it was immediately assumed that if you give employment to people who otherwise would be unemployed, it must be a good thing. And then as Duflo and others began to look at it in detail and said, wait a minute, it's not obvious that they're not just borrowing again to repay the original borrowing. That the stress level of, I don't want to put that into Esther Duflo's mouth, but people have worried that the stress levels that go with taking on these borrowings, the pressures, because as you know, 5 people in the community would guarantee the debt, the pressures are very hard for the family to bear. Nevertheless, you've found a mechanism now to provide employment, and now you have to worry about the impact, not just the output, which is people actually being in jobs, but what is the impact on their lives? Are they eating better? Is their health better? Are they able to leave their kids at school instead of pulling them out of school? That's the impact. And so it's a process of iteration, trying things, improving them, and moving forward. There will definitely be problems in the way of shifting our economies. Mm-hmm. But are they as great as the problems we face with our economies today? No. People ask us to prove that the ways of educating people that we're advocating work better than the existing system. But can they prove that the existing system is working? No, it's abject failure. So, like technology, half of the people won't believe in it and half of the people will, and time will tell.
So that's fantastic, because I think that's an area where I can violently agree with you, the importance of learning and improvement. So measurements will be imperfect. We know that. We've already got a number that are imperfect. And if we don't lead ourselves to believe in them blindly, and we continue to ask the questions of what they're actually producing and can produce and refine them, then I think we are moving in the direction that you have laid out so well in the book. We have just a moment or two, and so I would love a thought from you on, is recovering from the pandemic going to make this harder or easier for all of the entities that you've alerted us to that need to be involved in the impact revolution?
So, Jen, I think COVID will accelerate the change, just as it's accelerated remote working and shaken other habits and beliefs that we've held for a long period of time. I believe we're at a similar crossroads to the early 30s, that the crash of 29, which brought transparency on the profit of companies through gap accounting and auditors, is similar to the crossroad we're at today, where the COVID-19 crash is making us aware that we're investing in companies and we understand the profit they make, but we don't understand the impact they have, and we're looking for impact. I think governments are going to emerge from this crisis with hugely magnified social issues and environmental problems that have continued to mount because we've taken no action. And they're going to realize that they don't have the means to cope with these challenges, and that the only way to do so is to bring business and investment alongside them to bring solutions. And that you can't do that simply by changing taxation and providing incentives. You really have to do that by measuring their impact and then shifting taxation to tax those directly who are creating the damage, rather than the system we have today, which is very unfair, where we tax everyone in order to remedy the damage caused by some. Yeah. In short, I think we are living through an acceleration of this transition, and that the huge interest in ESG has in part to do with the heightened awareness about social and environmental issues which COVID has created.
Thank you. That sounds like a great place to end. And with the optimism that what we've all seen in the last year and more months to come will actually accelerate this transition. So Ronnie, thank you so much for the conversation today. It's been a real pleasure to learn from you, to discuss some of these important ideas that you're raising. There's lots of other questions in the chat that were raised by people. I know if you'd like to learn more, those of you in the audience, please do read Ronnie's book. It's fascinating, and there's lots and lots of examples and cases and arguments that I haven't had the time to discuss with him today. Please know that this event will also be published online, and we'll make sure that we share the link with everybody who's attended today. And if this conversation leaves you inspired, which we hope it does, there are many, many ways to get involved with social innovation and social entrepreneurship through the organizations that have hosted this event today, both Trinity Hall and the Cambridge Center for Social Innovation. Many of these are actually open to anyone, not just students and alumni. So there are public lectures like today's event. Thank you again for the first inaugural, and we're looking forward to many more. There are also opportunities to host students as volunteers or interns, direct support for emerging entrepreneurs to develop new business ideas. And as we mentioned earlier, the Cambridge Social Innovation Prize, which will be awarded annually to 4 outstanding leaders of social enterprises. Thank you again, Ronnie. Thank you again to our donor, Graham Ross Russell, and his family for their ongoing support of the Trinity Hall Entrepreneurship Network and for making this event possible this evening. I hope you've had an inspiring time listening.
Thank you very much, Jen. Great pleasure to chat with you, and look forward to working with all of you to make impact happen.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ronnie.